Welcome to this edition of The Citizen on the Record. Our guest this time is former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, a well respected voice in foreign affairs, a columnist and author, with his book How China Sees India and the World, Making Waves in the Diplomatic World. So it's very good to have you with us, Ambassador Saran, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Seema. Thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes. So now, obviously, I'm going to start with this whole specter of World War III. And we also have this Einstein's quote being bandied around on the social media, etc., which was attributed to him, probably paraphrased, when he said that he doesn't know what weapons will be used for World War III, but he can definitely say that it will be sticks and stones for World War IV, which is basically a comment on the kind of destruction that we are looking at. So, what do you think? Are we really on the verge of World War III now?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we are on the threshold of World War III, but I think we are certainly at the threshold of a much more divided, a much more polarized, and a much more tense international situation. Something that is quite unprecedented in terms of even the Cold War. Even the Cold War perhaps did not have so many multiple points of confrontation as we witness today. So it is a very worrying time. And of course, we must always be mindful of the fact that sometimes wars begin through miscalculation, through misunderstanding, just accidental sort of encounters. Those have happened in the recent past as well. So we should be mindful of that. But I think both the United States as well as China, while each would be upping the ante against the other, I suspect that they will be somewhat careful not to start a shooting war on this.
But it's slightly irresponsible behavior by the Americans, right? I mean, they have pledged and they have agreed to this One India policy. And when Nancy Pelosi wanted to go to Taiwan, the Chinese have made enough and sufficient noise. So, as at least a commentator abroad put it, they basically raised the bar of provocation, haven't they?
Yes, certainly. There is no doubt that this is, from the Chinese perspective, certainly it is a provocative act in terms of a one China policy. But to some extent, this has been a kind of an action-reaction process, isn't it? Because over the past few years, China has also been involved in very aggressive and assertive actions, unilateral actions in the South China Sea and in Asia Pacific. So one can perhaps see what the US is doing also as a kind of a response to what has been somewhat overbearing and arrogant attitude adopted by China over the last few years.
So is it because of that, or is it also as like, at least the laypersons like to say that Joe Biden, the president, is basically a weak president, and now with the mid-elections coming up in America, is trying to again use war and conflict as to hype up his own image and the image of his party?
It could be. I'm certain that there is certainly a domestic dimension to this visit by Pelosi to Taiwan. Partly it is her own personal sort of, predilections. Don't forget that not so long ago, after the Tiananmen riots in 1989, just a few years after, in 1992, I think, she had gone with a congressional delegation to Beijing. And she had, unfurled a flag supporting the Tiananmen demonstrators who had lost their lives in the riots, right in the heart of Beijing at the Tiananmen Square. So she has this, predilection, as I said, towards doing a bit of drama. And this will come in very useful to her in the congressional elections, which are due to take place very soon. This is also something on which, the Republicans would find it very difficult to oppose her. Because this is something which, enjoys bipartisan consensus. So it is not unhelpful to Biden and the Democratic Party if she has, poked the Chinese in the eye, as it were. And this will give her some political capital.
Right. So poking the Chinese in the eye is not a very good, not very good tactics, because China, I think you would be able to tell us more on this, is always, I mean, we've always got the impression when we covered foreign policy through diplomats like you, that it takes time to react. It puts all its pieces on the chessboard before it makes a move. So this time also, they've started some kind of a military drill in East Taiwan. They have said that we are not going to sit idly by, we are going to react. And they are looking now at Taiwan, at the anti-secessionist campaign, that they are looking at ending perhaps the tacit ceasefire that they have with the Taiwan military authorities, or whatever we call it. So do you see them now stepping it up also to, because they're not going to take time?
I foresee that China will certainly escalate in terms of what they are already doing for quite some time. That is military exercises in the Taiwan Strait, military exercises around the Taiwan Islands. They have been sailing, very close to the island on both the northern side and the southern side. Number of punitive commercial measures. You may have seen that a large number of foodstuffs imports have been stopped by China. There will probably be some further commercial measures which will be taken against Taiwan. But my sense is that they will not go beyond this. Take, for example, one very key element in the trade between China and Taiwan, which is semiconductors. Semiconductors, the Taiwanese are the most sophisticated, producers of very high-end semiconductors, chips, which are used in a range of high-tech industry. Now, Taiwan is one of the key suppliers of those semiconductors to China. So Chinese have been very careful to exclude that from any kind of, commercial punitive measures that they are adopting. So I see a certain pragmatism also in Chinese response. Of course, they are very angry and have every reason to be angry, but I do not think that they will go beyond a certain threshold of escalation. Part of the reason also for that prudence is that while you must be seen, particularly Xi Jinping, the president, you must be seen as being a strong leader, a tough leader who has retaliated against what the Americans have been doing. He also has to be somewhat prudent because there is a very important party congress coming up, later during the year. And at that, he will certainly want to be anointed as probably president for life, if not for the next 5 years. So it's a particularly sensitive time for him. So he has to navigate this very, very carefully. Be very tough, but at the same time, not create a situation where, in fact, a third world war, as you are saying, becomes a distinct possibility.
I see. So sort of take it to the brink of war, or appearing tough means like now what?
Well, China has always been a bit of a brinkmanship, actor in the past as well. But Chinese way of acting is strategic sort of, shall I say, prudence or strategic caution, but tactical sort of boldness. Don't take actions which may create a strategic problem for you. So here also, I think they will push the envelope to display their anger, display their, opposition to what the Americans are doing. But I still believe that barring any kind of accident, as I said, or miscalculation, it will probably not go beyond that.
So,
By the way, US also has been somewhat careful because, her aircraft, if you see the reports, did not take the direct route from Kuala Lumpur to Taipei, which would have taken the aircraft over the South China Sea and over the militarized islands which China has occupied, which are disputed islands, which the US does not recognize. But the US was, I think, careful enough not to go over that territory because that would have been perhaps even more provocative to the Chinese than it has been. So the aircraft took a fairly circuitous route,
okay.
avoiding the South China Sea completely before landing in Taipei. So you can see both sides are a little careful as well. It's a rather complicated dance, but I think we should also look at these elements which are sometimes missed in our analysis.
Right. And also this point that they did say that we are still committed to the one China policy,
right,
and that her visit is not really anything to do with that. So maybe that also.
Yes. Well, for the US, one is of course the provocation against China, but it is also, if you look at it dispassionately, it's not very good for Taiwan, is it? To be put in that position as a proxy, because this can be very damaging to Taiwan. I mean, the Chinese will take actions more against Taiwan because it is less risky, not so much against the US, because US is still a very, very strong military power.
Yes, and that's what I was going to ask you, because all that they've announced right now seems military drills around Taiwan from all sides, getting onto the anti-secessionists, as they call them, human rights violations further. So it's the Taiwanese who are going to really
pay the price.
Pay the price for this.
Yes. Yes, and the US will not come to their assistance at this stage, because even the strategic ambiguity is only if China is invading Taiwan and carrying out military action against Taiwan. But what it is doing around Taiwan, or military exercises or some threatening gestures here and there, will not, in a sense, trigger a US military response.
When you were the foreign secretary, I mean, there was Afghanistan, then there was, of course, the Middle East, and now we moved into Ukraine, and then we moved, well, at least it's not conflict yet in that sense, but the tensions are building up in that Taiwan region. So is it that this over these years, this idea of war seems to have become normalized, right? And can we hold the Americans directly responsible for this? Because they seem to have started all the wars, actually.
Well, that's a very easy charge to make, but I think more important is that there is a change in the geopolitical landscape, whether we like it or not, because the balance of power has shifted. It has shifted because the United States of America, despite the fact that it is still the most formidable military power in the world, it has a global reach which no other power has at this point of time. It is a diminishing power. Its relative strength is diminishing vis-a-vis not only China, but other actors as well. So you see that in various regions, also some of the regional powers are becoming more influential. They are becoming more assertive as far as their interests are concerned. And the kind of a constraint that was put on them due to the overwhelming power of the United States, that is no longer a deterrent in a sense. So you see, not just in Asia, but you see in other places as well, that there is a kind of assertion of power and influence by some of the major regional actors. So it is this change of the geopolitical landscape moving more towards multipolarity, with a cluster of major powers in different regions who are no longer sort of willing to be constrained in a manner that they were before. Secondly, there is also the kind of unpredictability which we see in the international arena. Much of it brought about by the sheer development of technology. Technology has become a very major element in the interstate relationship. So you have a number of, means of influencing or, even causing damage to other countries without using arms in the traditional sense. You can attack, for example, a country's infrastructure through cyber warfare, isn't it? So there are a number of other ways in which interstate conflict is being actually carried out. So we are faced with a much more complicated situation, and that is what is leading to perhaps multiple areas of confrontation, multiple areas of tension, more actors involved in this than was the case in the past. So was the US responsible for some of these wars? Of course it was. But it is not just that, you can very simply just point a finger to the US and say, they are responsible for everything that is happening. I think that's a rather simplistic way of putting it.
Yes, easier also to say. So this, taking this whole thing now to Ukraine and this whole playoff now, there in the arena was Russia and America. In your assessment, basically, how do you think that the Russians have actually handled this whole NATO-Ukraine crisis, given the fact that today in EU, the member nations are not completely in the camp of Washington. Washington itself is losing footprints in Europe, etc., etc. Just an assessment as to the Russian handling.
I think that Russians made a miscalculation.
Okay.
Because if you look at the earlier statements, when actually the invasion began, the expectation in Russia was that this would be wrapped up in a few days' time. That faced with a very massive invasion force, the government in Kiev will fall, and they may be able to put in place a pro-Russian regime, which would then, essentially be ready to align itself with Russia and would not go into the Western camp. That was a calculation. By the way, if you see some of the early analysis, even amongst Western countries, this was also their expectation that, Russia is such a formidable force with a reformed, army and command structure that Ukraine would not really be able to stand up to this. Now, that was a miscalculation because the Ukrainians decided to fight back when nobody had expected them to fight back. So what should have been a very quick operation, like what happened in Crimea, for example, yes, or earlier in Georgia, for example, it did not happen with Ukraine. Now, it has therefore become a much longer drawn out conflict than may have been the calculation before. And if the original calculation was to really alert the West Europeans and the United States that you cannot take Russia for granted, that in any kind of European security architecture, Russia has to be one of the key significant stakeholders. Its interests have to be taken into account, its interests have to be respected. And therefore, for example, there have to be legal guarantees that Ukraine will not join the NATO, because that would pose a direct military threat from NATO to Russia. Now, if that was the calculation, then it has gone, in a sense, horribly wrong, because if the idea was not just to take over bits of territory from Ukraine, but really to influence that larger European architecture, you have actually achieved the opposite of what you wanted, right? Because now you have Sweden and Finland who have reversed 200 years or more of neutrality thanks to their perception of a much more enhanced Russian threat. Now, that's not a small development. That reversal of neutrality by two major European states is a very fundamental change in the security situation in Europe. And a fundamental change, very adverse to Russia. And anything that they achieve through the further sort of war in Ukraine does not reverse this.
Right.
So you have ended up with a European security situation which is far more adverse to you than what you started off with. So
Right.
that is one aspect. The second aspect is that NATO, even if it is temporary, at least for the time being, it has been, in a sense, revitalized. Because, not long ago, Macron said that NATO was brain dead. Now, he would not make that statement today because NATO is far more united. And much more importantly, if you take just the role of Germany, which is a critical actor in any European,
Yes.
economic or security architecture, this was one country and the most powerful country in Europe, which had a stake in having reasonably positive relationship with Russia, which looked upon not just in the recent past, but even in earlier, if you remember Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik. What was it all about? That, for stability and security of Europe, it is very important that you must reach out to Russia and make Russia part and parcel of any kind of European security or economic architecture. And much of German foreign policy over the last so many decades has been actually directed towards that. Now, thanks to what has happened in Ukraine, maybe reluctantly, but the German posture has changed very dramatically. Its military expenditures are going to go up quite dramatically. And since it is the richest country in Europe, a 2% of GDP devoted to defense in Germany means actually that Germany will emerge over a period of time as the most powerful country in Europe. So all these changes which are taking place, I cannot see, even if Russia wins more battles in Ukraine, whether it is going to end up in a security situation better than what it was confronted with before it started the invasion.
That's so interesting. So if there's this bit of a slide down and this sounds very, very, like how it is right now, then the Americans have been able to actually, they have proved to be better strategic thinkers and long-term planners then with this whole intervention and support for Ukraine.
Well, I'm not so sure there are better security planners, because if you see the series of disasters that they have been involved in over the last 20, 30 years, one would not credit them being very.
So how do they fare in this? Now I'll have to ask you that because of the Russian.
I think in this particular case, perhaps there was a misperception both on the part of Russia as well as China with regard to how much was there a decline in US power. Russian perceptions, Chinese perceptions were very much influenced by 2 or 3 recent events. One was the Trumpian period in the United States, where it was, the politics of the United States became very, shall I say, dystopian.
Right.
No bipartisan consensus, which used to be a factor that any adversary of the United States had to take into account. That was no longer the case. Secondly, if you look at the response to the pandemic, compared to at least the initial Chinese response to the pandemic, China was able to show that it was much more successful. It had been, its whole system was completely geared to really winning the war against the pandemic. Look at what is happening in the United States. People are dying on the streets. They are not able to vaccinate people. Also the case in Europe, for example, this response to the pandemic. Then the very chaotic withdrawal of the United States armed forces from Afghanistan, which was there again dramatically displayed on the television screens across the world. So they may be forgiven for thinking that the United States of America, as they tried to project, is in terminal decline. Even if it is a formidable military power, it has lost the will to fight.
Right.
So this is something which you see very clearly reflected in the February 4 joint declaration between China and Russia on the during the time of the Winter Olympics. That is a kind of a very clear statement of how Russia and China see the balance of power between the West and the East. So the sense was, this is our moment because the West is in terminal decline. It will be unable to really retrieve its position because there are such structural factors involved, and we are an expanding, bloc of countries. And therefore, this is the time we should assert our interests. We should advance our interests. So you see that very clearly spelled out in that joint statement. Looked at from the point of view or the perspective that we now have after 2 months of the Ukraine war, I would say that particular judgment which was made proved to be somewhat premature. That is, China declared victory too early, thinking that the way was clear for it to really not be resisted. Its rise was irresistible in a sense. That is not proving to be correct.
Interesting. So that while we have a diminishing power on the one end, necessarily that power is not flowing to the two big players in the Asian region, which is of course Russia and China. And probably there are many more multipolar kind of balance of power which we are seeing and will see further, right? Would you say something?
Yes. So the point I'm making is that one, for China to have misjudged how much the balance of power has changed in favor of China and Russia. That it has now been quite obvious that it has not changed as dramatically as may have been thought by China and Russia, understandably because of what I mentioned.
Yes.
The domestic politics in the US, the response to the pandemic, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the general impression, as you yourself stated, that Biden is a very weak president. That was also, I think, in their minds, that this is a weak president, will not be able to really confront China in any kind of a powerful way. So that has been a problem. But the second problem is also China's assumption that it is by far the most powerful country, at least in the Asian region. Whereas in the Asian region, there are other substantial powers, may not be superpowers, but they are substantial powers. If you take, for example, Japan, if you take Korea, India, Australia, Indonesia, there are several countries in the Vietnam. These are maybe middle powers, but they are major middle powers. And so if you take their cumulative strength, it is actually quite significant.
Right.
So the Chinese assumption that it will be a free ride for them once they have managed to sort of push the Americans out of the way, that calculation, to my mind, is also not quite correct.
Right. So I'm just going to bring you towards the end back to our region and talk about Myanmar, basically, and the junta and the way it has executed for human rights activists. And this is after a long gap. Now, are we seeing something new again? I mean, the old coming back in a more vicious form where Myanmar is concerned? Or do we, as some commentators have put it, that it is actually again a regime which is feeling under pressure, which is weaker than it was before, and hence it felt the need to execute of the rights activists to prove that it was stronger than it is?
Well, one, this is most unfortunate because this is, in a sense, a reversion to type. Because we have seen in the past how cruel and oppressive the military regime in Myanmar has been. We had somehow become more complacent and more optimistic because against all odds, the military itself had seen the writing on the wall. It had started very major political reforms, Aung San Suu Kyi and the democratic forces, not fully, but at least partially, seem to have come back into positions of influence and authority. And we thought that this was now a gradual sort of incremental process towards greater democracy, greater liberalization. That has proved to be incorrect. Why did that happen? Because after all, the Myanmar army was behind the scenes still very powerful. It was also felt that it had a very useful democratic facade in Aung San Suu Kyi without having to lose much of its power and influence. So it is not very clear what triggered this change, because there didn't seem to be such a major threat to the position of the Myanmar military. Maybe there were interpersonal, problems between Aung San Suu Kyi and the military chief, because he was, by all accounts, very impatient with her and very impatient with, say, the space which was being provided to the insurgent groups. They were becoming more assertive in their own areas of operation. So there may have been multiple factors which led to this. There may have also been a sense that the world is sort of preoccupied with many other conflicts and problems. Maybe this is a good time for the military to get back whatever it had lost. And sanctions have not usually worked against Myanmar because as long as China, and to a lesser extent India, and also to some extent the ASEAN, are not willing to completely isolate the Myanmar military regime, sanctions don't really matter. I was in Myanmar from 1997 to 2001, where the military was still very much in power, and one could see that sanctions were not really very effective, mainly because China was ready to open its doors to Myanmar, and that is what led to China becoming a dominant influence in Myanmar, because it had a free run in a sense, because there were no competitors. So what is going to be the situation now? Again, we do not see China, and I do not see India, at least currently, joining any kind of sanction regime against Myanmar. Most of the ASEAN countries also may not join, even though rhetorically they may oppose what the Myanmar regime is doing. I do not really see an effective sort of sanctioning of or isolation of the Myanmar military regime. What these 4 executions is really a response to is, one, for the first time, the military is not able to play off the civilian democratic opposition, which is essentially Bamar based, that is the main majority ethnic group, and the various other ethnic groups. Because there has always been a divide between the Burmese ethnic group and the other ethnic groups like the Karens, the Shans, the Chins. This is for the first time where the civilian opposition, which is essentially majority ethnic based, and the various other ethnic groups have actually joined hands. Several of the civilian party elements from the NLD are actually getting arms training in the areas controlled by the ethnic groups. Also, for the first time, whereas under Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD was very clear that it would be non-violent in its opposition. What you are seeing today is that the opposition, even with respect to the liberal democratic elements, are no longer willing to be or willing to say that they will not use arms. So the nature of the opposition to the military has changed. One, because the civilian opposition and the ethnic groups have come together, by and large. There are exceptions, I do admit, but by and large, they have come together. This is a new element. And second is that the civilian opposition is no longer willing to be non-violent in its fight against or struggle against the military regime. And this is leading to a greater sense of vulnerability, a greater sense of anxiety on the part of the Myanmar military. Because so far it has been confident that the opposition will never be able to match it in military terms. Now it is beginning to be a little afraid that the opposition is becoming stronger. The execution of these four activists is partly a reaction to this sense of anxiety and also as a warning that if this continues, we will not hesitate to take very firm and even rather drastic kind of action against the opposition.
Right.
So to create fear, that any kind of public opposition will not be tolerated.
So one last question on this only is that you refer to India also not going to be able to support sanctions or will not. What is it that we've always flirted? I know that it's a neighbor, and I know that there are links with the Northeast, but we've always flirted with the military junta, haven't we? We haven't condemned it in the way one would expect a democratic country to.
See, I'm not really surprised for a simple reason that our stakes in Myanmar are very high.
Mm.
One, because four of our most sensitive northeastern states, some of which still have insurgencies, active insurgencies, some of those insurgencies still have sanctuaries on the other side of the border. And this creates, therefore, a premium on having at least a regime in Myanmar which is not actively working against you, which is not actively hostile against you, because they can make life somewhat difficult for us if they go actively in support of or tolerate these sanctuaries by these insurgent groups. This has been a major concern for quite some time, as you know. Yeah. Second is the Chinese influence in Myanmar. So all the security preoccupations that we have with Myanmar as a neighbor, they get heightened if there is a much more active sort of influence and even some kind of a collusion between the Chinese and a military regime in Myanmar. And this has also happened before. If you recall, the Naga rebels used to use the Burmese route to go to Yunnan, southern China, for training and for getting arms. So this is not a theoretical possibility. This is something that has happened in the past. So I'm not surprised that every Indian government has been very sensitive to this aspect. That while we may have to hold our nose and engage with the regime which is there, but our security preoccupations are such that we on balance, engaging with the regime in Myanmar, even if it's a military regime, is something that is almost a sort of a necessity. Doesn't mean, therefore, that you should not take a stand on things like what has happened. Yeah. I don't think that India, given its own nature of its politics, its commitment to democracy, at least having some kind of a statement, if not condemning, expressing regret that something like this has happened, and that our interest is in seeing some reconciliation process in being put in place. We would like to see countries of ASEAN, of which Myanmar is a member, ASEAN playing a much more active role in bringing about a normalization of the political situation in Myanmar. Is there any way in which India can be helpful in that process? Perhaps, those kind of statements may have been perhaps helpful. I'm not quite sure why the Indian government may not have made any statement. Since I'm not an insider, I don't know. So I would not like to comment on that. But I think even in the past, we have maintained that balance. even when I was ambassador in Myanmar, we always said that, Aung San Suu Kyi should be released, that there should be a process of reconciliation, that we would like to see, the restoration of democracy in Myanmar. Those were standard, statements that were made by India, even while we were engaging with the military regime.
Right. So while you were speaking, Ambassador, I was thinking of Sri Lanka. I was thinking about the silence from Bangladesh. I was thinking of what's going on in Pakistan. So we let you go with the promise that you come back to us for a separate discussion on South Asia and where we stand in the world today. So thank you so much. This was very, very illuminating and interesting. And thank you for giving us the time.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.